Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, the former Prime Minister of Canada, PM Harper, PM Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, President Karzai, the former President of Afghanistan, Prime Minister Bildt of Sweden, Prime Minister Rasmussen from Denmark, Prime Minister Tobgay from Bhutan, and Prime Minister Han from South Korea. Yeah, we'll have a family photo, please. Carl, please join them. Can I request the esteemed excellencies to join us on stage and the Honorable Prime Minister to take a seat, please? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th edition of the Raisina Dialogue. We are very grateful to the over 700 international participants who have flown in from over 100 countries to be with us in New Delhi to engage in 3 days of debates and discussions. We are delighted to welcome the largest ministerial presence at this dialogue since its inception. A special shout out also to our online audience joining us from around the world. We look forward to engaging with you and do send in your comments and thoughts on our social media platforms. A very warm welcome to the Raisina Young Fellows. This year we have 48 young leaders from 28 countries representing the best from government, media, business and civil society. They will join an ever-expanding network of nearly 1,600 alumni from over 100 countries, and from them, 100 of them will be joining us this year. Thank you for coming back again. We have also invited 150 students and young thinkers to this platform, including a delegation from the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. A very warm welcome to this cohort, and we look forward to your views on the world that you will inherit. We are also joined this year by over 30 heads of think tanks and research organizations, the largest contingent of such actors that we have ever hosted. We have curated over 80 sessions this year, and along with the ministerial addresses, the authors' corners that we have recently introduced, and our associated events, there will be over 102 conversations, ideas, perspectives, and viewpoints shared at Raisina Dialogue this year. I wish you all 2 engaging days ahead that will begin at 9 a.m. and conclude at 11 p.m. Let me welcome the ORF chairperson, Mr. Sanjay Joshi, to deliver the opening remarks and set the context for this evening. Mr. Joshi.
Thank you, Samir. A very good evening to all our distinguished guests. Honorable Prime Minister of India, Shri Narendra Modi ji, Excellencies, President Karzai, Prime Minister Clark, Prime Minister Harper, Prime Minister Carl Bildt, Prime Minister Rasmussen, Prime Minister Tobgay, Prime Minister Han, Honorable External Affairs Minister Shri Jaishankar, our partners from the Ministry of External Affairs, ministers, admirals, delegates, experts who've gathered from all over the world. Welcome to the Raisina Dialogue 2020. 2020 is an important year for us. The Raisina Dialogue turns 5-year-old. But more important, the 21st century finds itself at 20. Its adolescent years are, I would say, behind it. Yet societies seem unnerved by the change and transformation that seems to have been working in their body politic over all these 20 years. And like adolescents do, many have been responding somewhat awkwardly by retreating, becoming insular in the face of challenges that actually require far greater engagement. We've seen societies become more unsettled, politics around the world get louder, more strident, and the anxiety is not just being felt in the corridors of power, not just in the corporate boardrooms, but the anxiety is being felt on streets across the world. A palpable sense of the anxieties that we've discussed and debated at Raisina over the last 5 years seem to be coming to a head. Right from the first edition, the debate was about how the political and economic models the world had taken for granted at the turn of the century were beginning to appear fragile and weak. And yet the shape of the new economic and security realities was far from clear. In such a world, it was inevitable that competing ideas would jostle to draw the contours for a landscape which could make sense of the new world which was emerging. So you had constructs like the rising Indo-Pacific or the solidly emerging landmass of Africa and Greater Eurasia, or the promise of the new Arctic channels, all tempted strategists to draw scenarios for the new opportunities and the new challenges. But like all constructs, each of these also created their own space for cooperation. They also created space to catalyze old rivalries. And that rivalry, that instability, has seeped even into the domain of technology and trade, domains that not so long ago were imagined as the two irrepressible forces, bringing the world together, shrinking the world, drawing it closer. And from believing like true believers that digital technologies would emancipate and empower everybody, we now stand horrified at their potential to manipulate societies at a scale which was unthought of before. The convergence of the biological, physical, and digital is altering the assumptions that underpin human interaction. It's questioning the way we organize our societies, our workplace, our families. So what does our digital future hold? And then there is this ongoing battle to save the planet. For over 2 centuries, we have set us on a collision course with our own ecosystem. Will the 2020s be remembered as a decade we decided to collectively abandon all effort to turn back the tide? Will the 21st century finally come to age in a world that is more open, freer, and more sustainable? Or is it going to be one that is closed, unequal, and insecure? And these are questions that are being asked across the world. From the Middle East and Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, everywhere these questions are being asked. So hence the theme for this year's dialogue seeks to explore these challenges given the zeitgeist of what is being termed by many to be the alpha century. So with this, I welcome you to 3 days of debate, of new friendships, new partnerships. Let us put our heads together to seek that elusive consensus, the new ethic for a new multilateralism so essential in these times. And we have for you this special inaugural session in which we plan to plunge directly into our theme questions. We want to draw upon the august wisdom of the excellencies here who have been there, done that, hear from voices that continue to be engaged with the global imperative. So we have here a panel of leaders who have led their nations through times of disruption, through war and conflict, through geopolitical rivalries and tensions, through climate-induced disasters and development challenges. Leaders who, through difficult times, have ensured that delivering peace, prosperity, and progress to people remains at the core of their decision-making. And with this, let me invite the irrepressible Samir, my colleague, to carry this forward. Samir, the floor is yours.
And I'm going to take off right from where Mr. Joshi left, and because we have so much wisdom on this panel, I'm not going to give any opening remarks. I'm going to start problem solving immediately. So my first question is to Prime Minister Harper. How do we solve the problems of the Middle East? Okay, sorry. And since it's a rapid fire round, we need quick answers.
Tough for me to solve this one quickly, Samir. I also have to say, just before I begin, in Canada, we just suffered tremendous loss of life as a consequence of the Iranian action shooting down the Ukrainian Airlines flight, and this is obviously in my country right now, it's a subject of great sorrow, and I want to give my condolences to all the families affected. I think it's also the subject of great anger. I don't think any of us believe that Iran would have deliberately shot down an aircraft, but the very fact that Iran, believing such a thing could happen, would be allowing normal civilian traffic, I think tells you something about the nature of that regime and its priorities. And I do believe we need to see a change in Iran if we are going to see peace in the Middle East. I see an increasing number of states in the region, Israel that I'm close to, certainly the Sunni Arab monarchies, others who are increasingly trying to work together and see a common future and common interests. And you have this one actor that, quite frankly, is based on religious fanaticism and regional imperialism, and as I say, as a friend of the Jewish people, frankly, an anti-Semitic state. And I think if somehow, if there's any way through the protests in Iran or the consequences of this that Iran could go on a better trajectory, I think that would be very core to resolving the problems of the Middle East. Certainly not resolve them all overnight, but I think without a change in the nature of the government of Tehran, the Middle East will continue to be in turmoil.
Prime Minister Harper, irrespective of the politics of your time, and let's move to another geography now. You and your fellow leaders at that moment were seen as champions of the whole idea of a transatlantic relationship, a liberal order that was rooted in that region. Are we seeing the fraying of that relationship itself? Do you believe the liberal order that you were promoting so vociferously is suffering because the relationship across the pond is no longer holding valid for the frameworks that you created?
So I think in retrospect, there's been some fraying of that probably since about the year 2000. One of the things I think the end of the Cold War did was broke down to a large degree a common sense of mission of the Western allies. Now, I don't think that's going to disappear entirely, because the reality is that in this great and complex world that is in a lot of turmoil, on both sides of the Atlantic, we fundamentally share values, we share economic structures, and we share macro security interests. So I don't think they will disappear completely. I do think there's a permanent shift in Washington. Obviously, there are some shifts that are peculiar to this administration, but I think the sense that the United States will prioritize its own interests more strongly in the future and be more opportunistic about its alliances, I think that's probably here to stay. But look, I think the great challenge we have in liberal democracies, in Western democracies these days, is coping with political protests in our own countries, which has arisen, I think, primarily because of a combination of new technology, the uneven distributional impacts of globalization, and rise of nationalism. And I think these are things that creative leaders will learn to accommodate. And I think the great strength of of democratic societies is that they are often wrong, but over time they correct errors. So I think to the extent we're seeing some things now that are taking us off the path we've been used to, I think this will cause adjustments in leadership, and we'll learn to cope. And I still believe that in the long term, liberal democracy is really where the future is, and it's what most people aspire to.
I'll come back to you on a point, Mr. Harper, just in a bit, but let me actually now turn to Prime Minister Clark. Raisina has been a victim of climate change in some ways. One of our speakers couldn't make it because of what's happening. And in that sense, you, Madam Prime Minister, you were leading the government of your nation, you were the head of a multilateral organization, and in both these roles, the questions of development, of sustainability were close to your heart. Is the world going to achieve, in your assessment, its 2030 ambitions? Or do we see nations and corporations shying away from making the commitment they need to make?
There's two big sets of commitments that actually countries aren't delivering on collectively. One is the Sustainable Development Goals, which are in quite a lot of trouble on some of the core indicators. Poverty eradication, for example, as a goal by 2030, is not on track to be achieved at all, and that is tragic for the people living under that poverty line that we acknowledge set by the World Bank. Secondly, the hunger goal is not going to be met. The numbers of hungry people in the world have been increasing each year, not falling off. If you take education, the goal is for every child to be able to enjoy 12 years basic education by 2030. 1 in 6 children on current trends won't achieve that. So there's a need for some huge investment just in those very basics of human development. But then you couple that with the difficulty in reaching the climate targets set at Paris. And let's not even start on the biodiversity targets set at Aichi in Japan, which are due to be reviewed this year as well, which are also struggling. I think 2020 is going to be a critical year for sustainable development, with the Glasgow Climate Change Conference later in the year, which will need to agree the rules for global carbon markets, which could not be agreed at the Madrid meeting. And it's also the year when countries need to step up with their nationally determined contribution climate action plans, and we're well short of seeing plans which would get us to stay below that 1.5 degree global warming figure. So that Conference of Parties on the Climate Change Convention, the Conference of Parties in Beijing on the Biodiversity Convention, these are critical conventions this year for getting agreement to act on these challenges.
And what do you think is needed to make that climate agreement happen? Do you think the developed world is being magnanimous enough or brave enough to make some sacrifices and commitments that is needed to respond to climate change?
Well, let's acknowledge that the European Union, I understand, has set a zero carbon target for 2050, a net target, and that's very positive. My own country achieved what's almost unimaginable through its parliament in getting every member of parliament except one to agree on the zero carbon legislation. And okay, you can say perhaps it's not moving as fast and as far as it could in action, but in my experience, having set a zero carbon target for New Zealand for 2020 way back in 2007, another government comes along, it's not so important. To get national consensus around targets, I think, is incredibly important. So I'm encouraged by what my own country is doing. But in general for the West, I would say not only does the West have to lead with ambitious targets, because while many countries are now contributing to the carbon stock in the atmosphere that we have, nonetheless the historical burden has been built up by the way in which the West developed, so we have to pay up. And you asked the question, are we magnanimous enough? My answer would be not yet. We're not seeing climate finance come through in really solid commitments and payouts as would have been envisaged at Paris.
Prime Minister Tobgay, you're a leader of a country that's much loved, respected, and admired around the world. You're a happy country, but you're also a country that is at peace with its ecosystem, its environment. And perhaps there is a lesson for the world to learn from you. You're also much loved and admired by the polity in this country. Let me ask you a question that's something that's personal and close to your heart. Have the political leaders failed the planet?
Samir, I'm not a leader. I lost an election last year. Yes, but I do come from a country. I do belong to a country that is green. We are happily carbon negative. And by the way, Bhutan appears to be the only carbon negative country in the world. Suriname may be there. But to have just one country out of 195 countries to be carbon neutral is unacceptable. And yes, the developed world must step forward. We need champions. When you talk of climate change, this is a tragedy of commons in a truly global scale. And to solve such a problem, you need global champions. And champions must come from all countries, India included, but especially the developed world. Championship from Bhutan is important. The world is taking note of what Bhutan is doing. The world is taking note that 72% of our forest, of our land is under forest cover, that we are carbon negative. We sequester much more carbon than we emit, but Bhutan is tiny. And we have benefited because of the wisdom of our kings. Our constitution which came into effect in 2008, says that a minimum of 60% of our country must be under forest cover. And the world looks at that and says, wow. But I look at 1974. That's when our fourth king, he announced a policy at that time that required 60% of the country to be under forest cover. So the fight against climate change is going to be long and it's going to be difficult. Now, you mentioned our political leaders failing the planet. I would say no. The planet does not need political leaders. Earth does not need political leaders to survive. Mother Earth is going to do just well. Our political leaders failing our people, it's a resounding yes to that. We have to fight climate change. We have to take care of our planet, not for the planet's sake, but for our people, for our future. So, what lessons? Listen to our ancestors. They lived in harmony with Mother Nature. They did not cause the planet or the people any harm. If you can't hear ancestors, listen to the scientists. They are screaming that global warming has already taken place, 1.1 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. At today's rate, forget about today's rates, at Paris Agreement commitments, we are going to hit 3.2 degrees Celsius, sea levels are rising. Listen to them. And if you can't hear them, listen to the children. They are screaming every Friday. So the lessons are there all over the world. And because it's such an intractable, well, it is intractable in its nature because it is a tragedy of commons, a classic tragedy of commons at a global scale. And I want to put on record here that the UN is failing. In particular, the UN Security Council is failing. And this is why I have called for reform of the UN Security Council over and over again. This is an issue of the world's security.
Prime Minister, there's something else the world needs today, and I think your country has perhaps something to offer to all of us. We are a very angry world today. Everyone is angry. Everyone is upset. Everyone tweets in an aggressive manner. We are a very angry people. Can we not become happy like you?
As a neighbor of India, we are your closest neighbor and your friendliest neighbor. And I do believe that Bhutan, we don't have any anti-country. Is that what you're saying?
No, I said, people, the society needs to learn to be happier, more accepting, more receptive to ideas. Everyone seems to be in a hurry, and Bhutan has actually worked on creating this harmonious society and ecosystem. And how can we learn from you to build those?
Our contexts are very different. We have a very small country, was very poor until a few decades ago. Our country was just 700,000 people. And then we've had the good fortune of being blessed with enlightened monarchs. So development has taken place, but not at the cost of our culture, our spirituality, our environment. And there's been a lot of emphasis on good governance. And as a result, we have the democracy in place in Bhutan. And so by and large, we have no reason to be unhappy. The fundamentals of happiness, the conditions of happiness are in place. There's free healthcare, free education, clean environment. Our economy is growing sustainably, freedom of the press, you can express yourself. So the conditions of happiness are in place. And the social media notwithstanding, by and large, yes, we are happy. But what can the world learn from us? Besides the importance of exemplary leadership, I'm not sure what else.
Culture, identity, and good governance. I think those are three important words you raised. President Karzai, let me come to you again, a South Asian country. It will soon be 2 decades, sir, since the world forced the Taliban out of office. do the chances for peace look brighter today? And what can the international community do to make that peace durable?
Thank you, sir. Well, my friend from Bhutan spoke of Bhutan's relations with India as close. Allow me to say that Afghanistan is perhaps closer to India in lots of ways, and it's the right place for me to thank Honorable Prime Minister of India for all the support given to the Afghan people and for continuing to hold us in very close, dear terms. Peace in Afghanistan is the desire of the Afghan people, the only desire of the Afghan people. But peace in Afghanistan is also extremely complex an issue. How to put together our desire for peace with the complexity of international politics around Afghanistan, U.S. objectives in Afghanistan, and the regional complexity that we have. We also have the Foreign Minister of our good neighbor, Uzbekistan, Foreign Minister Kamlov here, who understands the situation well. And another old friend of Afghanistan, Germany's representative, I believe, is here. Afghanistan is in a neighborhood where for the last 3 centuries we've had some form or other of a superpower engaged with us. From the British colonial rule, then to their rivalries with the Tsarist Russia, and then the Soviet Union, and now the Americans, and our great neighbors as well. This presents Afghanistan with immense challenges of management of its own affairs and of the region and the global power structures. The Afghan people will come to the United States and its NATO allies after the tragedy of September 11 exactly with this hope that now...
President, can I request you to bring the mic closer to yourself? Thank you. Sorry.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
I thought I was loud enough.
And
with this arrival of the Americans and NATO force in Afghanistan, we felt we were now past the difficult period of our history. And for a number of years, things worked very well, till our allies began to make very serious mistakes, till those powers that supported the United States began to not support them as much as they did before, and our neighborhood became more complex. Yes, we in Afghanistan hope that the new American Initiative for Peace will work, and we support it. While we see that it may not exactly be a peace process as far as the U.S. is concerned, that it may be a rearrangement of things, but we are trying to turn it into a peace process. Pakistan, an extremely close neighbor of Afghanistan, its role is vital for peace in Afghanistan in many ways than one. Iran is an extremely important neighbor of Afghanistan. Likewise, it is Uzbekistan and other neighbors as well. India, Mr. Prime Minister, is a very close neighbor in spite of the distance that we have geographical between us. So India's role is extremely important. It's the management of all these roles and a proper management of them by us, the Afghan people, and an American objective that I hope will lead us to peace. Now, we've had for the first time in 2018, and again in November of 2018, and February of 2019, and May of 2019, 3 very significant meetings held in Moscow under the auspices and goodwill of the government of Russia. The 2 last ones, the February and May ones, were intra-Afghan dialogues with the Taliban that produced the first such event, an icebreaker, a landmark event. We hope that more such meetings will happen, and we also hope that the Americans will reach their preliminary understandings with the Taliban, so we can then launch on the intra-Afghan dialogue. Our National Security Advisor, Mr. Mohib, is here. We hope that a day will come that the Afghan government and the Taliban will be talking to one another, and us, all Afghans, will be there too, to make sure that we see peace.
President, I want to ask you two quick questions, and I don't think the answers are short enough, but since we are in a rapid-fire engagement. One is, how does the developments in the Middle East implicate Afghanistan? You know, what's happening in Iran, what's happening in the wider West Asia, the unrest there. How is it affecting your people? And what gives you this new optimism that you can do, proverbially, the deal with the devil? You know, there is a sense of optimism here that I'm hearing from you, which was not possibly the case a few years ago.
Right, right. Well, optimism we have as Afghans. We are, that's our nature, and we must continue in order to have peace. But on the Middle East and Iran, some very grave and unfortunate developments took place there. The killing of General Soleimani, and then the unfortunate event of the downing of Ukrainian plane. I was there after the events. I visited Tehran and met with the Iranian leaders. Look, there is anger there, surely. There is also sadness there for the plane that was down. But I've also noticed a lot of inclination in Iran for improved relations with the West. I also noticed while I was there that the Americans were not as tough in their rhetoric as they were before these events. That's a good sign, and I hope both will find common ground in promoting that. You must not forget that Iran is a great historic entity, a great cultural entity as well. It has one of the best languages in the world, and one of the best poetry and literary prides in the world. America is a great country, but America must recognize that you cannot force countries to follow your line all the time. They can't force a country as poor as we are in Afghanistan. How can they do that with others? So I hope common sense will come. I hope wisdom will prevail, and it's in wisdom that I see a better future for this region. That wisdom must begin with the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me come to Prime Minister Rasmussen. Sir, you were both a European head of government and also the Secretary General of perhaps the mightiest military coalition in the 20th century. Recently, your friends in France don't seem to be so enthused by the future of the NATO. And alongside, perhaps, there is a new excitement about a new arrangement with Russia, which is welcome. Based on your years in office, how possible is there a chance for a new Europe-Russia entente or a détente where we can have a relationship cordial? And how relevant is NATO unless it transforms dramatically to respond to the 21st century realities?
I do hope that we could embark on a new relationship, a new partnership with Russia, but I don't see it happen in the very near future. Well, NATO is the most successful peace movement in history. During the last 7 decades, NATO has guaranteed and secured freedom and peace in the North Atlantic area. And today, despite President Macron's statements, NATO is militarily stronger than at any point since the end of the Cold War. Partly due to the decision we took in 2014 that we in the next decade, all NATO allies will live up to the 2% target, that is, to spend at least 2% of GDP in defense. And partly because more troops have been deployed to the eastern part of NATO to deter Russia from even thinking about attacking a NATO ally. And that was, of course, necessary after the Russian aggression against Ukraine. That attack on Ukraine, the fact that they took by force Crimea and integrated it into the Russian Federation, was a clear violation of international law and a wake-up call for all Europeans. So this decision was taken in 2014. Well, President Trump likes to take credit for that, and if it helps to improve his understanding of NATO, then let's give him credit for that. The fact is that the decision was taken long before he was elected president. But the money is pouring into NATO defense right now, and this is the reason why militarily NATO is stronger than at any point since the end of the Second, I would say since the end of the Second World War, but at least since the end of the Cold War.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, and let me also bring India into the equation here. One, of course, you must have seen the recent statement by President Trump. He wants to create the NATO NATO in the Middle East. That's one element. And what do you think of that idea of expanding the sphere of activity for NATO? But more importantly, do you think there is a need now for European countries, and it could be through NATO or through the European Security Defense Mechanism, that India and the Europeans need to have a serious conversation on the Middle East? We share a border. It's called the Middle East. We call it West Asia, you call it the Middle East, but we have a few million people who live there, and a few million people from there live in your regions. So we have a human bridge that connects us. Is it time for us to work far more closely in managing our own understanding of that region?
First of all, according to the NATO treaty, NATO covers North America and Europe, and it will take an amendment of the treaty to expand NATO to include countries in the Middle East or Asia or elsewhere. That's not going to happen. However, I do share the view that NATO should expand its activities out of area, because in today's world, territorial defense is not only your own territory. You have to go beyond your own territory to actually protect your own people. Now, in the Middle East, we should engage much more. I think, not least, Europe is now paying the price for not engaging in the Middle East at a much earlier stage. But what could be done? I think realistically, NATO could expand its training activities in the Middle East to train local security forces to fight terrorism and to stabilize fragile states. Today, NATO has a training mission of 400 troops in Iraq that could be expanded as an example of how NATO could engage much more in the Middle East. Secondly, NATO could also take the lead of the anti-ISIS coalition in the Middle East. Today, NATO is not engaged in that, but NATO could do that. So you could accommodate Mr. Trump's wishes to see a stronger NATO engagement in the Middle East without expanding NATO to also cover countries in the Middle East. On a final note, I would like to say, we have spoken about hard security here. I think soft security is as important. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, I would like to see the development of a global alliance of democracies to raise their voice against the advancing autocracies. And in that respect, I would like to see India as a very strong component of such a global alliance of democracies. And I appreciate very much the leadership of Prime Minister Modi in that respect. And I hope we could engage India much more internationally in the coming years.
Let me move to Prime Minister Han. Sir, you're passionate both about East Asia and about climate change. Let me first talk to you about East Asia, another geography that's seeing a little bit of a churn and change. In your opinion, is the alliance framework that sustained peace in the neighborhood for so long, is it likely to sustain in the future?
I am strong believer in multilateralism, globalization, and open regionalism. I think most of Koreans are.
So I'll have to request you to bring the mic closer.
I think most of the Koreans are also strong believer in multilateralism, globalization, because we benefited greatly from this liberal regime. I think the post-war liberal regime, economic regime brought about economic prosperity, and this economic prosperity guarantees peace and security. Of course, alliance provides some peace and security, but I think more importantly, mutual economic prosperity in our region guaranteed peace and security. I am also a practitioner of the multilateralism. When I was Minister of Trade Industry 30 years ago, I was one of the initiators of APEC, which was utilized to promote the Uruguay round negotiations. But unfortunately, East Asia is at friction point, crucial point. Indeed, not just East Asia, but the world is at a crucial point, because multilateralism is giving way to unilateralism and free trade to protectionistic trends, and also integration is being disintegrated. So we are actually going through a very difficult time. At this very difficult time, the role of leaders are very important in that respect, and world leaders, particularly Prime Minister Modi's role is very important in reversing the current trend that make our life difficult in the future.
No, I just want to bring in Prime Minister Harper before I go back to climate change, sir. You were also in one of your previous interactions at Raisina discussing the Indo-Pacific. And what is your assessment of the region, India, other actors? Who is going to underwrite security and stability and growth of this region going forward?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think the reality of increasingly diverse and multipolar world will be that there aren't simple answers to that. But a big part of the answer in the future will be a role played by India. And, if I can pay tribute to Prime Minister Modi here, I think it will be the kind of India that Prime Minister Modi's vision is creating. That's, I'm not just talking about obviously energetic domestic reforms, but very much a country that's self-defined, aspires to be a cooperative global partner, but will be very much Indian. India is not going to be a Western, it's not going to be a bastion of Western liberalism, although it's a democracy. India was never going to be just another non-aligned post-colonial state. India has its own identity, own nationalism, for lack of a better term. And I think to the extent that under the current government, that identity is coming to the fore with big power, but I think globalist aspirations, I think is going to be a big part of the solution, and certainly a big part of the solution for those like Anders and myself, who care deeply about the future of democratic society as opposed to the alternatives that we face in the world of the future.
Prime Minister Han, let me come back to you on the worry that you have on the stability of the trading and security regime in East Asia. In your assessment, which country is likely, or which group of countries are likely to be able to sit down together and create an Asian Union, a much wider Asian Union for the future?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think, first of all, leading countries has to get together. Maybe G20 could be one of the alternatives, because G20, as you may know, was created in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. At the time, world leaders were united to solve the problem of global climate, the global financial crisis. If that mood, spirit of cooperation, is repeated now among the leaders of G20, we may be able to overcome the current crisis that we are now facing.
Thank you. My final set of questions are to you, Prime Minister Bilt. And why final? Because the future belongs to you. You are the most tech-savvy amongst all of us on the stage. The Bilt Commission was the first big modern report that tried to deal with the future of technology, the governance of technology, the management of the internet space. Do you think tech wars are inevitable? Technology is going to be the cause of conflict, or are you still an optimist who believes, pretty much like our Prime Minister does, that technology for good is the biggest driving force?
Well, I do believe that technology for good, it is a driving force, no question about that. But there's no question that there are conflicts. Not the sort of conflicts that we discussed earlier. It's another sort of conflict that we're seeing here. And the outcome of those will shape the future, no question about that. I mean, we are, in my opinion, you've heard me saying this before, we are at the end of the industrial age, we are at the beginning of the digital age. And if we go back to the beginning of the industrial age, what happened there? Those that had the technologies, mastered the technologies, decided the rules of that particular age, they controlled the century that came. The century was decided by those that mastered the technologies in the beginning of the industrial era. That's where we are with the digital age. And at the moment, of course, we have a war, if we use that war word, between the Americans and Chinese. And the Chinese try to, first, a great firewall around China, control everything inside, and then expand. And the Americans try to block the Chinese, say, we don't like their technologies, and there are some solid reasons for that sometimes. But I don't think either of these approaches is going to work a long time. The only way of doing it is to master the technologies yourself, to master the digital transformation of your economies and society to be better than the others. It's not by sort of defeating others by defeating them in that particular technology war, but by sort of inspiring them by the example of being better. And here, so the Chinese are doing some things good, no question about that, in terms of their business development. The Americans are still the most innovative society in the world. We Europeans have talent, but need to do somewhat more. India plays a rather crucial role. That has been said in other contexts before, but I would say it's even more important in this particular one. I mean, you've been doing great lately, I think. I've been impressed by sort of the way in which you digitalize society and economy and affordability and availability and all of these things. That's great. And particularly the fact that you are, and will remain, or even more remain, the world's greatest democracy. And where the world's greatest democracy moves in the beginning of the digital age will shape a lot of that techno conflict that we now see emerging between the Chinese and the Americans, which, if it goes astray, will be detrimental to both and be detrimental to us.
What is the role that countries like emerging countries in Africa and Asia will have in this rather zero-sum imagery that you've painted for us? It's countries that control technology that write the rules. So what happens to new communities in new regions that are still emerging?
Well, if you go back to the industrial age, to take that analogy, which I think is sort of useful sometimes, what made the Brits control the world? Well, they got the steam engine. Well, anyone can invent a steam engine. They got coal. They had a navy. What is of importance now is brain power. You need brains. You need talent. And in societies that give sort of freedom to the talent, freedom to entrepreneurship, rules of the game for that particular talent and particular entrepreneurship, science, education, and those things are not dependent upon natural resources. You don't need the coal mines of northern England. You don't need the oil fields of Saudi Arabia.
You don't need the iron ores of Sweden even, sorry to say. But you need the brains that are equally available all over the world. So in that sense, I'm sort of exaggerating slightly for the sake of the argument, in there, that says everyone is starting from the same. Not quite true, as we know, but it's important to have that model. Everyone has the chance to develop.
So as we close this conversation, what I really want to do is ask each one of you that as we move to this third decade, this century, what is one thing that you would want the world to resolve and respond to? That one thing, and I'll just go around the panel as we close. One single issue that you think requires our urgent attention.
Well, one mindset that we must have, going back to what we said, we need to understand that sort of we share these issues, be that climate change, or be that the rules of cyberspace, or be that the rules of outer space. They cannot be set, so to say, by Bhutan and Sweden, or India, or China, or even the United States. We can only do it together. And if we don't do it together, it won't happen, and we'll all suffer the consequences long term.
Prime Minister.
Climate change.
Climate change.
And,
Yes, I think climate change is very
I agree with Prime Minister that I'm a believer in multilateralism and I'm a believer in the UN system. And I want to take this opportunity of saying, earlier I said the UN is failing. COP25 is an example. COP26 I'm a lot more interested in, and Claire O'Neill is here. I hope everybody supports her initiative for COP26. I mentioned UN Security Council is a failure. Simply because in preparation of the next panel, I did some research, I Googled UN Security Council and climate change. One resolution.
That's what we
came
do
up.
in the research think tanks.
One resolution came up. And this is why I say the UNSC must be reformed.
Prime Minister Han, that single issue that is most important for us to respond to.
Well, I think climate change, of course, is one of the most important issues facing the humanity at this juncture and in the future also, because crisis of climate change will not disappear overnight. It's a long-term problem. And actually, it is consequence of the first and second industrial revolution. First industrial revolution invented steam engine requiring massive use of coal. Second industrial revolution invented combustion engine requiring massive use of electricity, gas and oil, which create a lot of carbon emissions. Now, this will not disappear overnight. It will take years and years, maybe 10, 20, 30. By the end of this century, you will not be able to solve. But problem is that we have to start trying to do something about it. And many developing countries are not really responsible for this. But the emissions that many developing countries produce today will impact our children also. So we are all together in the same basket. So we have to work very hard to find out really good answer to these problems. Of course, majority of the problems in financing and technology has to be borne by developed countries because they are able to provide. But doesn't mean they're developing countries have no responsibility. India, for example, China, Korea also, Indonesia, Brazil, we are all responsible. So unless we do something now, our children, Greta Thunberg, for example, their generation will suffer. Not all. So we have really to do something dramatical, some measures now, right now. Thank you.
Prime Minister Harper.
I'll be different. I'll say technology, the opportunities it creates and the problems it creates, mastering those things. On the economy, making sure that the number of jobs and opportunity created outweighs the disruption that's going to be caused to society and to existing jobs. On the political side, making sure that we realize the governance opportunities in technology as opposed to the social media disruption we're experiencing, and frankly, even on climate change. Climate change is not going to be solved by targets and enforcement mechanisms and plans. It's going to be solved by the development of technology that is lower emission but also cost effective with high density and large scalability.
Prime Minister Clark.
I think climate change is an existential threat. I think it exacerbates all known vulnerabilities. It's impacting on our ability to eradicate poverty and ensure that everyone has a meal every day that is nourishing. So it's an extremely urgent issue for human development, not just an abstract environmental issue. One thing that does concern me is the sort of air of hopelessness that there is around at the moment. You see that coming through the voices of young people. It's almost as if people feel that they're powerless. We're not powerless. Governments aren't powerless. We can do it. It requires transitions in energy, transport, urban design, requires transitions in agriculture, it requires retaining our forests. It's doable, but it needs political commitment and stepping up.
President Karzai.
Well, before I go to your last question on India's role in this larger region in West Asia, the Middle East, it is imperative for India to have that role by the many links that it has historically and currently. And on that, I've been advocating for a long time a more proactive Indian foreign policy in this larger region. And to answer your last question, we need a more humane world order and the Gandhian vision for non-violence and coexistence to get things right.
You have the last word, Prime Minister.
Yeah, if I have to point to one issue that should be solved, it is to ensure that new technology is used for good and developed on principles that respect freedom, individual liberty, and human dignity. And to that end, we need the world's democracies to join forces so that it is not China, it's not Russia, it's not the autocrats that set norms and standards for new technology or trade or any other global issues, but it's the world's democracies that dictate that we want freedom, we want openness. So I would point to that issue as the major issue to be solved.
Thank you, and I think we heard 4 words: democracy, multilateralism, climate, and technology. This is what we should focus on in this conference, and this is exactly what the agenda is going to speak towards. Let me invite the Foreign Minister of India to propose a vote of thanks and conclude the session this evening. And please join me in applauding this wonderful panel for their fantastic contribution.
Honorable Prime Minister, distinguished leaders, excellencies, delegates, participants, it's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks for the inaugural session of the Raisina Dialogue 2020. 5 years ago, Prime Minister, you gave us a challenge. It was your view that as a rising power, India should not just be participating in global conversations organized by others. You felt strongly that it was important that we create our own platforms, organize discourses, and shape narratives. 5 years later, I can state with some confidence that we have delivered to a great measure on those expectations. Lest it encourage the organizers to rest on their laurels, let me also promise you that we will keep improving with each edition. The Raisina Dialogue has 3 characteristics. 1, while focused on change, disruptions, and rebalancing underway in the world, it covers a very broad spectrum of subjects and debates. Most important, it is truly contemporary. 2, its participants are equally diverse. They range from policymakers and executors to thinkers and activists. The diversity addresses all yardsticks, whether of geography, demography, ideology, gender, or interest. 3, this platform brings together representatives and individuals who you may not commonly find at the same location at the same time. The exchange of perspectives that this allows could possibly grow into something more with the passage of time. These three characteristics, ladies and gentlemen, are exactly what Indian foreign policy today seeks to achieve: a focus on key challenges, a broad engagement with many parties, and managing, if not leveraging, global contradictions. Advancing our interests in a multipolar world and contributing to global good is what it is all about. So, having underlined the progress made so far, let me recognize all those who have made it possible. First, of course, the Observer Research Foundation. They have been a pleasure to work with as we set about imagining, planning, and executing the 2020 edition. The youngsters of the ORF who have worked so hard deserve our special praise. Team MEA, needless to add, has stepped up to the occasion as always. I commend to the speakers, delegates, and participants. You collectively define this dialogue and create the buzz for which it has become so well known. The 7 distinguished leaders, the Prime Minister actually called them thought leaders in his meeting with them. They deserve our sincere thanks for setting the tone for Raisina 2020. But most of all, Prime Minister, you have our appreciation today, not only as the inspiration of this dialogue, but our gratitude for unfailingly attending it despite your many responsibilities. So, ladies and gentlemen, you would all agree that we made a great start, a very thoughtful start with this opening session. I thank you all for being here, and I wish you 2 days of discussions and debates ahead. Thank you.
The Honorable Prime Minister will now leave the auditorium. I request you all to be seated as he does that, and we will thereafter proceed to the dinner venues for which you've been invited. Many of you have received the dinner invitations for different rooms. Please proceed there. The others are please welcome to join us at the buffet outside. Can I request the leaders to also step down and deconvene? Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick reminder. Some of you have received an invitation for the Foreign Secretary's dinner in the Shah Jahan room. You can proceed there once the VIPs have left the room. Others have received an invitation for the dinner in the Mumtaz. That too will be open at 7:15. There is a closed-door dinner at Roshnara, which some of you are invited to. Please proceed there. And the young fellows